Yeah, thanks everyone for joining. This is a safe landing talk. So Safe Landing is a group of aviation workers that are concerned about the climate impact of our industry, and we want to understand a future where we can have a sustainable industry that is compatible with climate action. Our website, safe-landing.org, our email address is there as well. Presumably you've all got it, but always feel free to send us an email if you've got any questions about our organization. Just going to have a quick recap of our demands because it's quite pertinent to this talk. So these are sort of 4 key demands that we distilled through various workshops with our members. So basically, as aviation workers, we demand that our industry leaders firstly be honest about the environmental impact of flying. So don't play down the impact. Don't just say we're only 2% of CO2. Don't ignore the non-CO2 impacts. Be realistic about the limits of technology to solve the problem. Don't claim that electric and hydrogen aircraft mean that it's problem solved, that sustainable aviation fuel mean that it's problem solved. Be realistic about what's possible with technology in realistic timescales. Next, be transparent about future regulations that are actually required to reduce emissions. So this is where the talk today comes in. At Safe Landing, we think we need, proper emissions pricing of our sector. We need proper constraints on air traffic, and we need policies to deliver that. And Frequent Flyer Levy is one potential option we've got there. And finally, we want our industry to have a plan that accounts for that over the next 10, 20, 30 years and supports workers during that transition, whatever it may be. Just so you're aware as well, we've got a petition to ICAO, which is to perform an aviation workers climate assembly. So this is something we're really big on. We don't think we've necessarily got all of the solutions, but we believe that workers are best placed to hear from the experts, understand all of the evidence around technology and around policy, and understand how the sector needs to transition and to transform towards a more sustainable future. So we've got this petition. If you go to safelanding.org/assembly, you can see the video, you can sign the petition and ideally comment on it as well. And the more the better. Please sign and share that petition as well. So yeah, just kind of context to this talk. We've got COP27 coming up in Egypt in just a couple of weeks now. Now you can see we've been having climate conferences for the last few decades, and the temperatures have been rising because the CO2 emissions parts per million in the atmosphere have been rising year after year after year. We're not going in a different direction. When you look at where those emissions are coming from, they are predominantly, half of them are coming from the richest 10% in the world, and the richest 1% are responsible for the same amount of carbon emissions as the poorest 50%. So within the aviation sector, we need to be really mindful of this. Rapid climate action is going to mean reductions for the wealthiest in society, and part of the carbon footprint of the wealthiest is from flying. So that's where the talk from Sola comes in today, because this is obviously quite a depressing picture, and often in our industry we get distracted with talk of technology greenwash. What's really exciting is that people are working on actual policies and quite innovative policies around how we start to address the inequality of flying and the emissions. So yeah, thanks very much for being here today, Sola, and I'll pass on to you. And just to say to everyone, the talk's going to be about 20-30 minutes, and we'll have time for questions, kind of half an hour of questions afterwards. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Finley. I'm really happy to have the opportunity to share our research with everybody. So let me share my screen.
I'll just say bless you to Grant, who I heard sneeze there.
Sorry, I didn't realize I had my mic on.
Okay, cool. As Finley mentioned, my name is Sola Zheng. I'm an aviation researcher at the International Council on Clean Transportation. We are an US-based international environmental NGO that publishes independent research to inform climate policy making. And in September, we published a report on a global frequent flyer levy. So this is what I am going to tell you guys about today. So before we go to the analysis, I want to provide a little bit of context of why this policy is relevant and what kind of problem it's attempting to solve. And first of all, let me ask everyone a really simple question. How many flights did you take in 2019? So before COVID came into our life, and very simple options: no flight, 1 to 6 flights, and more than 6 flights. And here we're talking about one-way flights. So if you took a round trip without layover, that's 2 flights. And please note the answer to yourself. And in the following slide, I'm going to show the share of global population that fell into one of these 3 categories in 2019, based on our estimates. So here it is. So based on our relatively conservative estimate, meaning that it will only be more skewed than the estimated results, but not less skewed. So in 2019, at least 76% of the world did not fly at all. About 22% flew occasionally, so less than 6 flights. And if you took more than 6 flights, then in quotation mark, you beat 98% of the world. And this number might seem surprising to a lot of us who ourselves like fly frequently, or people around us all fly pretty often. It's hard to put that into perspective sometimes, without looking at the actual like global picture. And it is this kind of unequal participation in flying that really drove the idea of the concept of a frequent flyer levy, especially compared to like road transport. This is a transport service that's enjoyed by, a privileged few of our entire world. So this is kind of the equity perspective that of aviation emissions that we're really trying to tackle. And then at the same time, as I think Finley already alluded to, and you're probably familiar with, the problem of aviation emissions is just getting bigger and bigger. Under business as usual projections, it will more than double the 2019 footprint in around 2050. And in just last month, we finally have a global climate goal of achieving net zero by mid-century, proposed by ICAO. And then the graph on the right is showing, the 3 biggest like decarbonization levers that can help us get there, hopefully. And there are aircraft technology, operational improvements, and the biggest lever being alternative fuels, including biofuels, synthetic fuel, hydrogen, and maybe a little bit of electricity. So all of those technologies combined, ICAO is quoting about a $4 trillion price tag, and that's for all of the stakeholders combined. And that is about $121 billion each year between 2018 and 2050. So it is a huge number, and obviously, like, private sector is going to contribute a lot of it, but it is also without doubt that governments need to step up with as well, using public funds to subsidize the cleaner fuels in its early stages, so that it can more quickly reach economies of scale and reach cost parity with fossil jet fuel. And this is where the idea of carbon pricing comes in, and then our research is really trying to figure out whether frequent flyer levy as a form of a carbon pricing is going to raise the finance more fairly. And so here, I think maybe people are already familiar with the concept, but a frequent flyer levy is essentially a levy that escalates as you take more flights in a year. So we created this illustrative schedule of the levy with the intent of the scenario to be raising $121 billion of total revenue in a year, as sort of, demonstrating a case here. So in this illustrative schedule, the first flight is tax-free, the second one is taxed at $9, and then your 20th flight in a year is taxed $177 US. And that is because of the escalation. There's also the blue bars showing you the rolling average. So if you took 20 flights in a year, the average amount of tax on each of your tickets is about $89. And in the following section, I'm going to talk about how this kind of levy, this amount of levy would impact different groups of people, and by calculating that, we're trying to get at, whether the distribution of cost burden of this tax is going to be fair enough. So let's move on to the analysis. So first of all, when I talk about distribution of cost burden, we used 3 different angles to look at it. So one, how does frequent flyer levy impact frequent flyer versus infrequent flyers? And second, how does it impact high-income countries versus all the other countries in the world? This is a definition used by World Bank, but it's an equivalent of what we call developed countries in some other situations. And then thirdly, how does the levy impact people from different income brackets from a global perspective? So first of all, let's look at the high-level results. So here I'm showing with the icons, what is the share of global population, and what is the share of all the flights taken in 2019, and what is the share of the amount of tax burden. So the amount of tax revenue that would be generated from a certain group of people. So in each of the icons is 10% of the world total. So, and then there are some hollow humans that you will see, which means it's less than 10%. So we all know this number by now, that frequent flyer is about 2% of the world population. They took 40% of the flights in 2019, and they would have paid 80% of the total amount of the tax in the world. And then secondly, there are 16% of people who live in the high-income countries. They took about half of all the flights in the world, and they would have paid 2/3 or almost 70% of all the taxes. And this second angle kind of involves some heterogeneity within countries as well. Even though these high-income countries do have more frequent flyers, that doesn't mean everyone in these countries fly often, right? So the concentration on the country perspective is not as pronounced for that reason. And then third, if we look at income, so top global income quintile, it really just means the richest 20% of the world. So 20% of population took 80% of the flights, and they would have generated almost all of the levy revenue, which is 98% of all the taxes that would have been collected. So I'm just trying to show how a small subset of the world is responsible for a disproportionately large amount of flights, and with the frequent flyer levy, they are really shouldering a vast majority of the tax burden. And by this design, the goal is to alleviate the burden on the rest of the world who didn't really contribute to the problem as much, and who might have never flown before and would take their first flight in the next few decades. That kind of dynamic is what we're trying to differentiate here. So these are the high-level results. I will, in the following slides, provide a little bit detail for each of these 3 angles, so that we can see the actual values. But before I go into each one of them, there is one piece of information I want to provide, and is the escalating levy. But we for comparison and then showing that, like, contrasting purposes, we also analyze a flat tax. It's almost the same idea as the air passenger duty in UK right now. It's just a flat $25 tax on each of the flight a person takes, and that $25 tax would generate the same amount of total revenue as this escalating levy schedule, so that we can compare the distribution of cost burden while controlling for the total amount of revenue that's being raised. And so with that in mind, let's look at, first of all, the impacts on frequent flyers versus non-frequent flyers. So the bars are showing the total amount, the percentage of amount of levy that's going to come out of people who fly once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, up to 20 times a year. So each number is representing kind of a category of a category of people. So you can see how the red bars are showing that under flat tax, people who fly once are gonna pay about like 22-23% of the total amount of levy. So like, even though each of them only flew once, there is a lot of them, and therefore a lot of the almost 1/4 of the revenue is going to come from these very infrequent flyers, and it kind of decreases out as the frequency increases. But what the frequent flyer levy, as the name suggests, is trying to accomplish is to shift that burden towards the right tail, the right side of the graph, the more frequent flyers, and it kind of spreads out that burden, quite evenly among the people who fly, more than 6 times. And this is the most obvious finding, where it's, as the name implied, it should be accomplished with such a levy. And so moving on, let's look at the country level findings. So here, let's first look at the left side of the table. It's the amount of levy that would be collected from different groups of countries. So for the total of $21 billion, 81 billion would come from high-income countries, because they have a lot more flyers and a lot more frequent flyers, and that's about 2/3 of the total. And then on the right, we are showing the historical aviation emissions between 1980 and 2019. And in this, for this statistics, high-income countries are responsible for about 70% of the historical emissions. So this is a very, this is not by design. This is like a surprisingly aligned results, where high-income countries would be paying for a majority of the revenue, and that's kind of corresponding to their much higher contribution to the historical emissions. And this is relevant for any kind of international discussion about climate finance for aviation, since it's not just the emissions going forward that matters, the emissions today also matters greatly. And the other countries are still looking for more growth in the industry, and therefore if the financial burden spreads only based on the future emissions, then that's to an extent unfair for those other countries. And then to sort of take this onto the geography like geographical lands, we plotted the differences between the two levies. So whether you would pay more or less under a frequent flyer levy compared to a flat tax is shown on this map. So the countries in red and green shades, the countries in red and orange shades are those that would pay more in their frequent flyer levy because they have more frequent flyers, and the countries in green and blue shades are going to pay a lot less, or even just almost nothing under a frequent flyer levy, because the vast majority of their population either fly infrequently or doesn't fly at all. So this is really showing the shift of cost burden from the global south to the global north. And in doing so, hopefully, the global countries in global north are paying for, their emissions to date and their like high emissions going forward, and giving the other countries a little bit more room for growth without extreme high financial burdens. And then while this is happening, like the industry is still being decarbonized, because the same amount of revenue is being generated, but who's contributing and who's being impacted is different with the different tax policy. So that is the analysis on a country level. And lastly is, the one that's most that's least predicted by us, because it's hard to think about the cost burden on a global income perspective without having specific numbers. So here, let's start from the left, and the left two columns are showing you the income brackets on a global level, and then the lower bound of their income. And then the middle column is showing, per capita wise, how many flights they took in 2019. And you can see how it's all under one up until the 80th percentile, where it averaged 1.3 flight per person, and onto 4.6 flights for the top 5%. And then the right side is showing you the comparison of how much revenue is coming from each of these brackets, and you can see how even under an APD, like a majority of the tax would be collected from the top 10% richest, which makes sense since flying and income are highly correlated. But if we do implement a frequent flyer levy, that concentration will be a lot higher, at 90% for the top 10% richest. And then, if we count in the 80th to 89th percentile as well, it's showing you 99% here because of rounding, but it's more like 98%. And that's almost all of the $121 billion could have come from just 20% of the world, which is still a large amount of people, but at least you're leaving the other 80% out of it. And then if some of them wants to take their first flight ever in their life, then they don't have to, at least they don't have to worry about the extra cost, the climate cost of flying, since they never even contributed to the flying before that date. So this is the income angle, and I think this really speaks to how taxing aviation in general is relatively progressive because of how concentrated it is by income. And that's something to think about more broadly, just beyond frequent flyer levy specifically. Okay, so in terms of what it means for policy, this is really, we're getting a lot of questions about how do you actually implement a frequent flyer levy? It sounds really complicated, and it is, and we're not definitely by no means denying that. So I think the most important tool that we would need is a flying frequency database. So that's something that no one's tracking that closely right now, because if anything, it's being tracked by each airline's royalty program, and then an average person, they might take flights with different airlines in a year. So this is something that doesn't exist right now, and then is really, but will be really key to a frequent flyer levy. And obviously, relatively accurate accounting will be important, so that people don't pay less or more than they actually need to. But we acknowledge the difficulty of accurate accounting for this kind of data. So maybe we can start with tiers and have 1, 2, 3 flights and 3 to 6 flights, for example, as as a buffer for some negligence in accounting, and then people in each tier would have the same amount of tax for those flights. And obviously it's really important to be able to protect the privacy of each individual traveler. The data has to be personal, but making sure that it's not being used for any other purposes would be really important. And then the second biggest challenge is really to the case where some people travel a lot for business, and then maybe in the middle of the year they're taking their vacation, their one vacation trip personally, and or the vice versa. Some people traveled a lot for leisure, and then for their 10th flight in a year, it's a business flight, and now the company has to pay that amount of levy. So this is quite tricky. So we're still thinking about the logistics, the real world logistics of figuring that out. But I think the principle is that we do need some kind of information about the purpose of a trip, because I think it's there is no and doesn't make sense for a person to pay the frequent flyer levy for their business trips, right? It's the companies should handle that burden, and hopefully reduce unnecessary business trips as well. And then a person should only be responsible for their leisure trips. So we're thinking about maybe a retrospective accounting, whether that's possible to solve the problem of having a lot more business trip or leisure trip compared to the other. And then thirdly, in terms of the revenues collected, obviously the whole point of the levy that we are proposing is that it will be used to fund clean technologies, and especially high integrity SAFs. And then for one possibility is for it to be to allocate more of the revenues collected to those countries that are in more urgent needs, right? So that is the equity concern. On the other end of the policy, it's the distribution of revenues, and then because a lot of the countries where the aviation is still going to grow might not have the means and capacity to make sure that it starts off as a cleaner operation, as it possibly could. So those are the main challenges, and we're still trying to flesh out more of the details. And in terms of specific next steps, obviously we're trying to layer the emissions informate data on top of our current analysis. It was difficult to gather really detailed information about how often people fly around the world, and then it's even more challenging to have the emissions details on that level, on that granularity, right? For example, one person who travels 20 times a year, what kind of, does it take, do they take more long haul flights or short haul flights? Where do they fly? That all affects the kind of the carbon intensity of their flights. So that kind of emissions details is our, analytical next step. But obviously policy wise, we're trying to identify an avenue of, proposing a real world policy that is similar to the concept described here. We'll probably have to start from the country level and rather than global, because it's much easier to collect data, as a national government on its residents. And then thirdly, we're getting a lot of questions, and I think the world is paying more attention to private jet trips. So obviously the same concept of taxing the people who fly the most really should also apply to those private jet users, where they fly even more often, and then their carbon intensity is even higher than an average commercial flight. So that is something to think about going forward as well. Okay, so that is all the information that I wanted to present. I'm happy to dive into questions.
Thanks very much. There is quite a few questions in the chat already. It'd be good, I mean, if you have put a question in the chat, feel free as well to put your hand up and you can just ask that in person. I know, just to start with, we had a question from Jeff, which is when you were showing the income percentiles and how much was being raised from each. He was asking if that was the flat. Yeah, I think it was that one. So I believe that's from the frequent flyer. Well, actually, yeah, it's got both of them on it, doesn't it? So the flat tax is the APD, air passenger duty, and the right column is frequent flyer levy. I did have a question on this one because it kind of seems like two kind of things that would seem quite important to me would be to compare firstly this to a jet fuel tax or an emissions price, which is equivalent, and look at, so even though you'd expect that to be more the people that fly more to fly further and to use a lot more jet fuel, so you'd think a jet fuel tax would be much higher than 63% paid by that top income decile, if that makes sense. And I'm wondering if you didn't do that because of lack of data there as well, or if there was another reason.
Right. As you just mentioned, and I was trying to allude at the end of the presentation, that we, I think, have an understanding that generally people who fly more or people who are more well off are taking longer flights, and they might also get onto premium seatings a lot more often than others, right? So their per passenger emissions will be higher. So, but it is really hard to layer that kind of that kind of data is kind of not high fidelity as we can find it to be right now, so it's hard to layer that on top of it. But you're definitely right that the flat tax itself, if it's an emissions tax, it would be a little bit higher than what you're seeing here.
I just like kind of specifically on this, there's this paper by Stefan Gosling where he calculates 1% of people are 50% of emissions, which is a slightly different calculation from what you did at the start. You had slightly different numbers. Did you have a look at that paper and did you decide there was like too many assumptions in there rather than actual data?
So we definitely looked at that paper really closely. I think he made really reasonable estimates from the global level, right? And then he was that 1% was kind of the assumption that a calculation that based on some survey data that was done in like countries like UK and US about how often people fly. So there are those are the only like primary data that we have about how often people fly. And then I think there's that kind of data that gives some information about what's the ratio of people versus population versus flights, or population versus emissions, and he kind of extrapolated it out to the rest of the world, and with the assumption that obviously lower income countries are going to have an even more drastic like concentration, like a smaller amount of people would be taking up a lot more of the flights. So I think the takeaway is that no one has the precise answer to this, and I think Gosling definitely took a quite reasonable approach. Ours is a bit more statistical, and then a bit more income driven. So the frequencies that you're seeing here is from a regression between income and flying frequency. I think our as I said, our estimates are on the conservative side. But I think it gives the idea of, at most, if we estimate the least skewed version of this, how it would look. And I think Gosling is more, it might be truer, because I think the real world distribution is even more skewed than what we are modeling.
Okay. Got you, yeah. So next, Alex Lincolnback, so he's asking, assume the predicted generation of revenues based on the assumption that flights would be booked as they are now, would the incremental increase in rates not actually put off a large number of frequent flyers, thus generating less revenue than predicted? So basically what he's kind of asking, would air traffic be affected? Have you considered that air traffic might decrease based on this, and is that factored into how much revenue is taken, or have you kind of assumed that people just keep on flying despite this?
Right. So there is a slide that I did not show, which is a very rough estimate that we made about how much like demand would reduce with something like this. It's very theoretical, I would put it that way. So the black line obviously is the original demand, the 100%. The yellow line is the flat tax. It would be about a 6 to 7% reduction. It kind of slopes up because people who travel more often might have a higher elasticity. Lower elasticity to changing price. And then this blue line is kind of getting at how theoretically, if you travel more often, you'll have a much higher levy, and you will cut your demand a little bit more. And then the overall effect is the same as the flat tax, because the total amount of tax is the same. So the overall, it's also just a 6 to 7% reduction in demand. It's just spread out differently. And I'm saying that this is theoretical because obviously the fare data that we were using a global average fare of about like $200, but in reality, a plane ticket for someone who travels that frequently could be a lot more expensive, or it's going to be zero because they're using their points. So there's a lot of a wide range of things that can happen at this other end of the demand curve. So I think, but in reality, yes, the demand will decrease a little bit. The amount of revenue generated each year, at least like in the second year, will be slightly lower, right? Because people responded to the price change in the first year. But then going forward, it probably stays around the same because the incremental change of the tax would be really small, if that makes sense.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So there's more questions in the chat, but I'll go to Jeff if he's got his hand up, and we can go back to the chat after.
Okay, thanks, Sola. I guess my first question is, what exactly are you taxing, and how do you propose collecting it? I mean, is it up to each country to pass this, have their political leaders pass it?
So it'll be similar to air passenger duty. It's like a departure tax of some sort. So obviously each government has to agree to do it, right? And to impose it onto the ticket sales. on all of the platforms. But it would not be like a jet fuel tax. It would literally just be a ticket sales tax. And then the idea is that it will be linked to how many you've flown that year. But then if that's hard to do, then some kind of retrospective tax accounting, like our income tax, might need to be applied, if that makes sense.
So it seems like if you're taxing, well, first of all, you have to know the historical record of the passenger to be able to tax them. But what you're doing is you're taxing the passenger, and it really has no impact on the airline. There's no incentive for the airline to reduce their fuel usage. And I guess your goal is to reduce the number of flights flown. Was that a good guess on my part?
Right. So when frequent flyer levy was first proposed in the UK, it was strictly a demand management tool. And you're right. The way to reduce emissions through this levy is basically reducing flights. It's not incentivizing improvement in carbon intensity, right? But I think we are taking a twist of that concept to use the levy as a tool to kind of decouple the growth from the emissions, if that makes sense. Like the goal is not to, the goal is to, to cover the price gap between SAF and fossil jet fuel so that it can actually be deployed at a wider scale so that we can make the flights lower carbon, using the revenue, and then the actual amount of demand reduced is kind of a byproduct at this point. And the main goal is to accelerate the decarbonization progress. So this is purely like a fiscal tool. Like it has to be done by the governments. Like they will have to make sure that the revenue goes to the right use. Right, it's not incentivizing the private sector actors directly, if that makes sense. But obviously the frequent flying activity itself is kind of what's fueling I think the industry growth a little bit as well. So kind of getting at the idea of frequent flying has to come with a cost may also shift the mindset of the industry a little bit that this is you need to act quickly so that we don't have to have this tax in place all like go forever, or we don't have to have a crazy amount of tax on your frequent flyers where eventually your business will be hurt if that's the case.
Okay, I have another one or two, but I'll get back in line, let somebody else ask a question first.
Yeah, it's all right. We can come back to you, Jeff. Thank you. So I'll go to one in the chat and then I'll go to Lena, who's got her hands up. So Jim sort of asking who collects the tax and what happens to it, which you kind of answered there, and I think you answered in the pack. But he's also kind of mentioning, you might want to expand on that, but also sort of saying visiting friends and family. I think this is when you were discussing leisure and business. It's whether there should be an allowance. I think obviously visiting friends, you could literally say anyone was your friend to get around this, so that feels unlikely. I know that Possible, who first proposed the frequent flyer levy, did think about having some sort of allowance for migrant families. Did you include that kind of thinking? Because that is often a criticism of it, is for people that have moved far away and just considering their needs.
Yeah, so that is definitely like work in progress. It is, first of all, tricky to define what is like a more necessary flight versus a less necessary flight, right? So obviously, at least right now, we're thinking that the categories shouldn't be too detailed because there will be a very controversial. But obviously, in our case, the first flight is tax-free, but in reality, you can make the first 1 or 2 or 3 flights tax-free to kind of, especially depending on the country, right? If you have a big immigrant population, or you have a lot of migration within countries, then you might want to lapse that amount to make sure that people get to see their loved ones without paying any insane amount of tax. And also the fact that, you know, the starting tax is relatively is you know, by a lot of standards pretty moderate, so hopefully that's not going to get into the ways. But also, like, you know, hopefully some kind of retrospective accounting could allow more flexibility in terms of, even if you took that trip at the end of the year, maybe it can count as your first trip because it is for certain purposes. So that's definitely worth considering very carefully when designing this kind of policy.
Cool, thanks. Lena?
Thank you. Yes, thanks so much for doing this study and presenting this to us. I think it's very, very key instrument that we should push for, a frequent flying levy. I also like actually that you changed the name from flyer levy to flying levy, because it targets more the habits and not so much the individuals only. Might make it easy to implement it. However, I'm not sure about the tax-free first flight, and especially not tax-free first 3 flights or something like that. Also because because a free flight a year is still quite a lot for our climate crisis. Then I would also actually not like to play it out against the kerosene tax, because I do think a kerosene tax is also very important in order to stop this tax injustice between like car fuel and air and aviation fuel, and because it is actually a tax that is imposed at airline level and targets the industry and not only the consumer. So I think it can be implemented both. I mean, hopefully. I know it's difficult to implement. And third, I wanted to comment on what you said on the usage of the revenues for decarbonization of aviation. I actually, I actually never talk of decarbonizing aviation, because it suggests that we can do that, and I think it will be very hard, and if achievable, only if the flights are reduced to a very small amount, and only in the far future when we have enough, other fuels, or totally different systems of batteries and electric flights. So I find it quite strange to use the revenues to give them to the aviation industry so that they can develop their technologies, and I would find it a lot better to combine this approach with the global adaptation levy on aviation that has been proposed already many years before by least developing countries like the Maldives, and and using this money to support adaptation to climate change in these countries.
Those are great points. And first of all, I do echo that, 1 flight per person for everyone around the world, that's already blowing out of, like, I think getting out of the scope or the magnitude that we can imagine. So that is definitely like a concern of unlimited growth. I think our views about reducing demand versus the optimism if you can maybe decarbonize the aviation is that there is kind of this message to the industry where if the private sector can make it happen. If they can put in enough investments and develop the technologies to decarbonize, then they don't have to shrink their business and have the demand reduced, right? Because if the problem can be contained, obviously the last resort is to reduce demand. That's definitely an effective way to come to manage emissions. But we kind of, at least at the moment, want to provide these options on the table that, you know, you have the potential to hopefully cut your carbon intensity down quickly, and then have your growth somewhat preserved. That is kind of the optimistic scenario that we're kind of envisioning here. Obviously, I think it is quite challenging. We're very time constrained in terms of the temperature increase and what the cumulative amount can do to the overall system. So I think, you know, in like maybe 10, 20 years down the line, we might not have a choice. And then on the kind of providing finance for the industry, that kind of idea, I think it's a little bit, to me, it's similar to, you know, renewable energy and electric vehicles, how it first came out as more expensive than the fossil fuel, the fossil like energy, and then there is some kind of government subsidies, right, to both of these, you know, greener alternatives to make them a little bit more cost competitive with the fossil fuel. So I think it is, you know, it is a similar idea here where, you know, either government use their existing tax revenue or some additional tax revenue to achieve to put in place that kind of subsidy, so that the industries will have an easier time surviving and competing with the traditional conventional energy sources. But that is not to say that will solve the problem like super quickly or entirely. And that's why this, I think the tax amount and how you allocate the tax amount can vary, but how you allocate it will be the key. And yeah, I don't think I disagree with the potential of using it for adaptation and some other non-aviation purposes, depending on how promising these technologies would become in the future. Right? I think we're still constantly adjusting our strategies here.
Yeah, I think it also is important. It's quite, I think for me, there's kind of three elements to this. Firstly, how to design the policy, and then how to actually implement it and collect it. And then once you've collected it, what to do with it. And that there's kind of three separate questions there that have quite a lot of complexity to them, and could easily be just talks in themselves. Thanks. Shall we go on to Andy? So he just had this question about the percentage of people that take one flight per year. He was expecting more to have taken one return trip, so 2 flights in a year than a single one. Is that because you're talking about, so when you say someone takes one flight, is that me flying from UK to Spain and back to the UK? Or have I just flown to Spain and stayed there? I think is the question.
Right, that's a great question.
Yeah, if I can say, I think one of your early slides sort of distinguished between a return flight as being 2 flights as opposed to a single flight. And so I think my question is, all those people on that single flight, how do they get home?
Yeah, that is quite a conundrum that I was also, you know, I was trying to make sense of it when I was doing the analysis. And so the survey data that we use to validate our kind of statistical approach. So first of all, because if it's statistical, some of the number comes out to be like a spread between, from, for example, 0 to 20. So it is hard to avoid the distribution will naturally assign a lot of people to this like 1 and 2 like being like categories. And then in the survey data we use to validate the results, sometimes it's really hard to know what the question is asking, because it just says how many times you flew last year, for example, like, but different people would have different interpretation of that result. So it was hard to know what those validation, like real world data meant to begin with. So therefore, I think we are just using these numbers as like a way to analyze the distribution, rather than kind of indicating, we're not trying to report on how often people flew in a year. But I think you're like in any case, like the category 1 and 2, 1 time and 2 times are quite like interchangeable here, and they don't really affect the rest of the results, because we're mainly just talking about, you know, 1 through 6 as a group, compared to the other group who fly more often than that. But yeah, you would be, I guess I was surprised that a lot of the survey answers, a lot of people chose one flight, and then sometimes like the survey question did ask about like just single flights. So I'm not sure why those people answered one flight. How did they get home? I don't really know.
I'm pretty confident they meant a return flight. I think most people, if you ask them how many times they flew in a year, they'd say 1 or 2, but they'd mean return flights. But yeah, so yeah, just that's kind of how people speak, isn't it? So there's a couple of questions. So Chris and Andy asking similar questions around how the tax would apply to different fuel types. So if there was a hydrogen or electric flight, would that be excluded? Or if there was sustainable aviation fuel? Kind of to me, this comes down to the fact it's not an emissions price, so you can't. It's kind of potentially, if it was 0 emissions, you could say it's not a flight. But then there is, even with electric or hydrogen, there is emissions, right? And with SAF, there is definitely emissions as well. So to me, that feels like a limitation with not looking at emissions.
Yeah, for sure. I think for the time being, this is like probably not looking at emissions is probably fine, because the share of SAF in our system is so small. And even going forward, like SAF will be blended at a few farms and airports, right? It's really hard for you to say that you are flying on like 100% SAF flight. I mean, you could, but it's like commercially, it's probably less common. I think one idea is that, you know, going forward, there probably would be SAF credits that you can purchase, just because of the accounting problem that I just described. I think it's natural that people would need to buy SAF credits to prove that they flew on some percentages of SAF anyway. So those amount of SAF credits could probably offset some of your levies, and play out that way in the near future. But when SAF is more prevalent, I think you know, we do want to take into account the emissions, hopefully. I think the frequency approach is just the most straightforward in terms of data collection, because, you know, ideally we would want to charge a levy based on the emission amount for each person, but that's even harder to calculate and harder to execute.
Yeah. It seems like a recurring issue is that lack of data, and it's really important that we track emissions per flight and that sort of thing. Just want to check, there's some more questions. There's a question from Manuel. I think Jeff had some more questions, and Lena's got her hand up. Are we good? People can obviously leave whenever they like, but are just particularly Sola, are you able to stay for 10 more minutes, or how much are you needing to leave?
Yeah. Sorry, I was reading the chat. Yeah, I'm done.
That's all right. You good for some more questions for those that want to stay? Awesome. Shall I, if I ask Manuel's, and then we can go to Lena, and Jeff, if you've got more questions as well, put your hand up and we'll come to you. So Manuel's kind of asking just why the tax rates seemed pretty low to him. So basically, why would you not go for double the tax, for example?
Right. So I think because of the goal here in this particular paper is not to reduce emissions, therefore the tax amount was solely pegged to the total amount of revenue that's being generated, which is this $121 billion number, that's what we used. And we, at least to our perspective, that's already a pretty big number in terms of total amount of money being raised. So this schedule, coupled with how we model people, people's flying frequency to be, is going to get you to that 121 billion. And I think part of the finding is that, the tax amount doesn't to be that high if the goal is to just generate enough revenue. Obviously, if you want to hit demand harder, you will need a lot higher prices. I mentioned 6 to 7% reduction, right? So if you want to drive, for example, 25%, I think that's what the UK Jet Zero consultation was referring to, that, the amount of demand that needs to be reduced, 25%, that needs to be, a lot higher, like in the hundreds, the price here. So yes, it would need to be higher if the goal is to reduce more emissions right away.
Oh yeah, thank you. I suppose just while I'm having a look at questions, I saw Lena put your hand down. Put your hand up if you've got a question. I was just going to ask, like, the other thing you can do is apply APD in bands. So like you say there's a air passenger duty for a flight that's 0 to 1,000 kilometers, from 1,000 to 2,000, 2,000 to 3,000. So you end up paying a lot more if you fly a lot further. And that also seems like quite a sensible thing to do, because my kind of take from this is it's incentivizing your first flight of the year to be a really long one. It's like, when you've got your tax-free one, you might as well fly to Japan rather than fly to Spain, for example. So that's kind of like another, do you think that's quite a sensible middle ground as well? Is that something that you'd advocate for?
Right, so we thought a lot about that as well. The idea of I think what it's called, like, air miles levy in some places. It does approximate emissions a lot better, and it's getting closer to like a carbon tax, but also you can have escalation, right? However you want it to be. The caveat here is what you just described, right? That people would want to fly like a longer flight as their tax-free flight, but I think in my mind that some like longer flights have much fewer alternatives. For shorter flights, you can actually try to like drive or take a train or take a bus. But the longer flights, especially if you have like family overseas, it's considered less like replaceable. So from that perspective, like air miles levy is a little bit punitive on that sense, but obviously air miles levy can give a little bit of quota that's like not taxed, so that you can fly a long flight if you need to, but obviously it's agnostic of who needs to fly that long flight, who doesn't, right? So yeah, both are not perfect, I would say.
Would you not say that it was a lot better though? Because I think that what you said, there was a bit of a misconception. Like if you converted all short haul flights to train, you'd barely save any emissions. If you cut 10% of long haul, you'd save a large amount. So the majority of emissions come from long haul, and the majority of those are leisure flights, right? They're not people visiting friends and family. Like 95% are leisure. So do you not think it would be a bit more, from like an inequality point of view, pretty important?
I think, yeah, I think it's hard. We really don't have like good enough data to kind of validate what you were describing. It's probably true that like a lot more of the long haul flights are leisure rather than like other purposes. But yeah, I think it will have to come down to the actual percentages of different purposes in different stage lengths. And I would say that, if you do swap all the short haul flights with train, it's actually not an insignificant amount of emissions. I think it's about, short haul is about like 25%, of US domestic. So that's still like a sizable amount in the grand scheme of things. So I think, yeah, I think I don't think one is significantly better, but I think it definitely has its advantages.
Okay, Lena, do you still got a question?
No, it was exactly this topic. I just wrote it in the chat. Thanks.
Okay, no worries. That's good. We already covered it. Jeff, I was just wary. We kind of need to go back to you. Did you already?
I can ask you. I can ask what I was going to ask here. I just honestly, I don't see this as doable whatsoever. I have no idea how you could institute this, because basically what you're saying is that, I mean, I think it's obvious that people that travel the most have the most power and influence in the world. And you're asking those with the most power and influence to basically put this into place, because I don't see how it's going to be put into place without the support of those people. You know, and I'm not saying that's right. I'm not trying to justify it, but I just think in reality, I've been working on trying to get a carbon tax here in the United States where all the money's returned to everybody on a per capita basis, a lift that's too big for us to swallow. This is just kind of another, you know, like level higher than that doesn't have market forces, and I just don't see how this could happen. So I guess the question is, how are you going to make this happen?
Yeah, I mean, that is the $1 million question. I think, you know, throughout the process of analyzing this and talking to people about it, I think we are, like, we do think that this study is more like a thought experiment, like exercise, rather than a proposal for a policy. I think the philosophy behind this kind of this concept is that, you know, you can pitch it to the most wealthiest, the wealthiest people, and be like, if you want to fly, like if you want to preserve your rights to fly, you need to devote your resources into making it less climate, like less emissions intensive, right? Like that is one way to proposition this, especially because I think we're seeing a lot of private jet, like I don't know, like celebrities and high net worth individuals, their private jets are being like tracked on Twitter nowadays, right? And then like I think some of them, like the CEO of Louis Vuitton recently sold his private jet, be like, because people are tracking me and I don't want to use it anymore. So I think people are being aware that, like, getting aware of how their behavior is considered problematic. So I think for them, like, since money is a abundant resource for them, this is a way that we can make them useful to make them like contribute to the problem solving process. Obviously I will need really strong political will to actually implement, but this is kind of the whole idea behind this paper, is that, you know, we have an elegant way to gather resources. You know, you only need this really small amount of people to contribute some of their, maybe not so much of their money, and we would have the resource. So yeah, I think it is quite challenging. It is quite kind of up in the air, like literally. So we are also open to more ideas of how to approach this in the real world.
It's kind of the climate crisis in a nutshell, really. The problem Jeff described is we can't solve the climate crisis without getting the wealthiest in society and the people that are powerful to change things and put in policies like this. So it might seem impossible, but the alternative is a collapse of civilization and us losing everything. So it seems worth trying, and it seems worth fighting for, I would say. So I think the thing that really, like, policies like this really excite me because they're practical, they're doable, they're completely doable. You could do this tomorrow. It's not require some sort of Leonardo da Vinci insane invention. It's quite simple to do. It might seem a little bit complicated how to implement it, but it's not any more complicated than Bitcoin or anything else. This is completely possible. It's not really that difficult, I would argue. And I'd kind of encourage people not to talk in kind of language of this is difficult, this is a challenge, because the people blocking it will use that language, and we need to be saying this is easy. This is really easy to do. And yeah, I think we I would often kind of like work with different environmental activists, and this isn't actually on a lot of people's radar. So I think having an awareness campaign amongst in the environmental movement about policies like this is really important as well. So I'd really encourage ICCT to think about the communication of it to the environmental movement. A lot of people just really have a really low awareness of this whole thing, and be quite keen to discuss how we can communicate it as well. Yeah, sorry, Lena, I saw your hand go up and down again there. Did you have a final question?
It was just a comment on what you said. I wrote it in the chat, that I think the difference is that we should not ask those in power to implement this. It won't happen. But if we really pressure them to do so, because the civil support is so big and they're actually losing, like the wealthy are actually losing power, then it might work. And that's what we have to do.
Yeah, and absolutely. And obviously people on this call are from within the aviation industry as well, right? And I think we need to recognize that policies like this are necessary. And actually they're really important for our own industry, that we start implementing this stuff, because there simply isn't enough money in the world to scale SAF just coming out government's pockets. It will need to get more expensive to fly, and it's important to do that in an equitable way. So yeah, finishing on that, thanks very much for your talk. Thanks very much for staying for some extra time to field quite a lot of different difficult questions as well. And thanks very much to everyone for coming along and for making it a really good discussion, and for asking some really good questions. So thanks everyone, wherever you are. Have a good evening or a good morning or a good afternoon. Yeah, and hopefully we'll have some more interesting talks in the pipeline from Safe Landing as well. So see you all soon.
Excellent. Thank you, Finlay. Thank you, everybody.